Most of the time, when I sit down to research a story, there's a structure to it. There's a crime, a timeline, a person who's responsible. Even in the darkest cases, there's usually something concrete to point at. A motive, a pattern, an ending that at least pretends to make sense. This one didn't give me that. There's no suspect here, no confession, no clean explanation waiting at the end. Just a house, and that already makes it uncomfortable. What drew me to this case wasn't just a headline or a shocking photo. It was a paper trail, police logs, news reports, first-hand accounts from people who didn't believe in hauntings until they were standing inside one. And the thing about 30 East Drive in Pontefract is that it doesn't start dramatic. There's no instant chaos, no screaming, no flickering lights on day one. It starts the way a lot of real stories do, small enough to ignore. And that's where people usually get stuck, because once you decide something isn't serious, you keep deciding that, right up until it is. This case has been called one of the most violent poltergeist hauntings in British history. That phrase gets thrown around a lot, usually by people trying to sell books or scare tourists. But in this case, that label didn't come from believers. It came from witnesses that had nothing to gain by talking, and a lot to lose by admitting what they had saw. Tonight, we're stepping away from true crime in the traditional sense, and into something that sits just outside of it. A case with records, with names, with reports that exist whether we're comfortable with them or not. So, grab a light, and let's step into the dark together. The Pitchard family moved into 30 East Drive in August of 1966, and for a while, nothing happened. Which is important because real cases almost never begin with chaos. They begin with inconvenience. The first things noticed were sounds, quiet ones, knocking, scratching, movement upstairs when everyone was accounted for downstairs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that sends you running into the streets. If anything, it was the kind of thing that makes you feel slightly embarrassed for even mentioning it out loud. Old houses make noise, pipe knocks, floorboards shift, and if you ever lived in a place with thin walls, you know how creative sound can get at night. So, that's what the family told themselves. At first, the disturbance didn't have a pattern. No specific room, no specific time. Just the occasional sense that something had moved when it shouldn't have, or a door that hadn't been left quite the way that it was found. Small enough to ignore, annoying enough to notice. And this is usually where the story stops, because most people either move out or nothing else happens. But here is where 30 East Drive starts to separate itself. The noises didn't fade, they began to multiply. Footsteps were heard crossing rooms that were visibly empty. Knocks were coming from inside of walls. Not like plumbing level knocks, but like deliberate knocks. The kind that sounds spaced out, like someone might be testing where you are. And then came the objects. Small items at first, household things. Something would fall with no clear reason. Something else would be found in a different place than it was left. Still explainable, still deniable. But denial takes effort. And the more effort you spend explaining something away, the more you notice when it doesn't cooperate. At one point, family members began experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of being watched. Not in a dramatic horror movie way, but in a quiet, persistent way. The kind that makes you turn around even though you already know nobody is there. Sleep became difficult, tension built, and stress has a funny way of muddying reality, which is exactly why skeptics later pointed it as a cause. Except stress doesn't open doors, and stress doesn't make footsteps follow you down a hallway. By the time the family acknowledged something wasn't right, the activity had already shifted. It wasn't just happening around them anymore, it was responding. That's usually the moment people stop joking about drafts and start checking locks that were already locked. And this is where the house stops being passive, because next, it wouldn't just be sounds, it would be movement, and not the kind you can blame on a building settling. By the end of 1966, the activity levels inside 30 East Drive had changed in a way that's hard to ignore once it happens. The noises were no longer random. They were timed. Footsteps began occurring in a direct response to people moving through the house. If someone walked upstairs, the sound followed. If they stopped, it stopped. Witnesses later described it less like background noise and more like something keeping pace. At first, the family tried to treat it lightly, the way people often do when something makes them uncomfortable. Jokes, shrugs, nervous laughter. That only lasted until movement started becoming visible. Chairs were reported shifting positions without being touched. Objects slid across surfaces instead of falling. Doors opened and closed on their own. Not slowly, not creaking, but decisively. That difference matters, because there's a line between something breaking and something acting. By early 1967, the disturbances were no longer confined to empty rooms. Family members reported objects being thrown while people were present, not dropped, not knocked over, thrown with enough force to cross an entire room. This is also when multiple witnesses started reporting the same visual description: a tall, dark figure appearing briefly inside the house. It didn't drift, it didn't flicker, it stood, always briefly, always silently, and always gone before anyone could react. This was when the name the Black Monk began circulating, not as a dramatic label, but as the simplest way witnesses could describe what they were seeing. A robed outline, dark, solid, human-sized. No facial features were ever clearly reported, which oddly enough made it worse. In mid-1967, the escalations became physical. Family members later reported being struck by unseen forces. Some described being pushed. Others described being grabbed or pulled without warning. The most disturbing were the reports involving the children. Accounts of them being lifted from their beds or thrown across rooms by something no one could see. Those claims weren't treated lightly. They were repeated constantly, described in similar ways, and spoken about with visible fear, not exaggeration. And regardless of belief, the idea that something inside that house appeared capable of physically overpowering children changed how the situation was viewed. At that point, it was no longer about strange noises or misplaced objects. People were getting hurt. And that's when the family stopped trying to understand what was happening and started trying to stop it. They called the police. When officers arrived, they didn't witness everything, but they did witness enough. Reports described unexplained movement, objects shifting, noises with no visible source, and importantly, the officers stayed longer than expected. Keep in mind, police don't linger in situations they believe are imaginary. As word spread, journalists, clergy, and researchers began visiting 30 East Drive. And instead of calming down under scrutiny, like many alleged hauntings do, the activity intensified. The more people that entered that house, the more aggressive it became, which is the opposite of what skepticism is supposed to do. By the time 1967 came to a close, this was no longer a private family issue. It was a documented case, one that had moved beyond personal testimony and into official observation. And this is where the house starts to earn its reputation, because next, it wouldn't just react, it would start to target. By the time outsiders started entering 30 East Drive regularly, the house no longer behaved like something being observed. It behaved like something responding. Journalists, paranormal investigators, and clergy arrived expecting to document activity, or disprove it. Many assumed they would witness nothing at all. That assumption didn't last long. Reports from this period described sudden, violent movement with no warning. Objects were thrown across rooms in front of witnesses. Furniture shifted while people were watching it. Heavy items, things that required effort to lift, moved without any visible cause, and the presence that had once appeared briefly began appearing longer. Multiple visitors described the same figure: tall, dark, robed, always silent, always motionless, not rushing, not threatening in an obvious way, just standing there. Which for most people is worse. Several witnesses later admitted they didn't run, not because they weren't afraid, but because their bodies simply just didn't respond fast enough. The atmosphere inside the house was repeatedly described as oppressive, heavy, and disorientating. As if the air itself resisted movement. At this stage, humor disappears from the reports. People stopped trying to explain what they were seeing. They focused on leaving. Police officers were called on more than one occasion during this period. While not every visit resulted in dramatic events, there were enough unexplained incidents to justify official documentation. Officers reported objects moving without visible cause, loud bangs from empty rooms, a general sense that something inside that house was not under control. Clergy was also brought in, including ministers who attempted prayers and blessings inside the home. These attempts did not calm the activity. In some cases, they corresponded with escalation, and that detail matters, because one of the most common claims in exaggerating hauntings is that attention makes things worse. In many cases, that's convenient. Here, it was consistent. The more authority entered the house, police, clergy, press, the more aggressive the activity became. At least one investigator would later state that the house felt less like a location and more like a boundary that had been crossed. Witnesses began reporting that the disturbances no longer felt random. Certain individuals experienced more activity than others. Objects would be thrown towards people, not just across rooms. Noises occurred directly behind or beside individuals, timed to their movements. The sense wasn't that the house was active, it was that something inside was aware. And by the end of 1967, the family and many visitors reached the same conclusion, whether they believed in ghosts or not. This wasn't something that could be managed. It couldn't be reasoned with. It couldn't be documented into submission, and it didn't stop when people told it to. Eventually, the family left the house. Although not dramatically, not overnight with screaming neighbors, they just left because staying had become unsafe. And once the house was empty, something strange happened. The activity didn't end. It waited. This is usually the part of the story where someone clears their throat and says, "Alright, let's be reasonable." Because once a case reaches this level, explanation shows up fast. And to be fair, they should. If you don't question something like this, that's not open-mindedness, that's just switching your brain off. So let's talk through the main explanations that have been put forward over the years. This is the most common label attached to what happened inside that house. Poltergeist cases are often associated with stress, emotional turmoil, or adolescence, usually centered around one individual with activity that feels chaotic rather than intelligent. And on paper, some of that fits. There was a family under stress, there were children in the home, and the activity involved movement and physical force. But here's where it starts to fall apart. Poltergeist activity is typically unfocused. Objects move randomly, energy spikes and fades. There's not usually consistency. That's not saying that it wasn't possible. At 30 East Drive, witnesses repeatedly described something else entirely. The activity followed people, reacted to presence, escalated when authority figures arrived. That's not chaos, that's interaction. This theory leans heavily on environment and mindset. Fear builds, anxiety spreads, people begin interpreting normal events as threats. And yes, stress can absolutely mess with perception. Although, stress doesn't shove furniture across a room in front of journalists. Stress doesn't throw objects towards people. And stress doesn't convince multiple unrelated witnesses to describe the same figure in the same way. At some point, group hysteria becomes the label people reach for when they don't have a better answer. And in this case, it leaves more unanswered than it explains. Drafts, old wiring, structural issues, vibration from nearby roads, all reasonable, all responsible to consider. But drafts don't pick favorites. They don't wait for someone to enter a room, and they definitely don't stand silently in corners wearing something that looks suspiciously like robes. If this was just a badly built house, it was also somehow the most emotionally intelligent badly built house on record. Some researchers link the figure to local history, specifically a medieval monk said to have been executed nearby, possibly for crimes against children. But important clarification, there is no solid historical evidence confirming this story, and that matters. The strength of this case doesn't come from folklore, it comes from behavior. Whatever people saw inside the house didn't announce itself, didn't explain itself, it didn't seem to be interested in being understood. It reacted, it resisted, and it didn't stop when it was challenged. Which leaves us in an uncomfortable place. Because if you remove exaggeration, if you strip away hype, if you ignore the parts that feel too movie-like, you're still left with a house that produced consistent, escalating, witnessed events that no explanation fully shuts down. And that's usually where people stop asking what it was and start asking something else entirely. Why that house? There's a reason stories like this linger, not because they're flashy, not because they're dramatic, but because they refuse to settle into one clean answer. With true crime, there's usually a point where the chaos stops. Someone is caught, someone is named. Even when justice fails, the shape of the story always stays intact. This case doesn't do that. There's no suspect to study, no motive to unpack, no ending that wraps itself up and stays there. Just a house that behaved in ways people couldn't control, or predict, or fully explain. And what sticks with me about 30 East Drive isn't the most violent moment, or the darkest claim. It's the consistency. The way unrelated people arriving at different times describe the same atmosphere, the same pressure, the same sense that whatever was happening inside that house was aware of them being there. That's the part people struggle with, because once you accept that something might be reacting, not just existing, the story stops being about belief. It becomes about boundaries, about what we assume we understand, and what happens when something doesn't care about those assumptions. And maybe there is a rational explanation we haven't found yet. Maybe one day someone will pin it down neatly. But until then, this case sits in that uncomfortable space between probably explainable and not dismissed. And that's where the unsettling ones always live. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you spending the time with me. If you've heard another explanation for this case, or if you think something about it gets overlooked, I'd genuinely like to hear your take in the comments. If you enjoy deep dives like this, whether they're true crime, paranormal, or cases that just blur the line between the two, consider subscribing and sticking around. New stories drop regularly, and this channel is built for people who like digging deeper than the headline. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, and stay spooky.